Why did Germany and Austria-Hungary start a war they knew they'd probably lose? The answer isn't in Sarajevo or the ultimatum to Serbia. It's in something much deeper, a geopolitical chessboard closing in around them, where every passing year worsened their chances of survival. What you're about to discover is the exact reason why these empires risked everything in 1914.
Any student can recite the surface-level answer: the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914, and Austria's subsequent ultimatum against Serbia, whom they accused of sponsoring the attack. But this explanation doesn't hold up under serious scrutiny. Both Berlin and Vienna understood perfectly well that a war against Serbia would almost certainly bring the Russians into the conflict, triggering the European catastrophe both powers feared just as much as everyone else. Military strategists in both empires were famously pessimistic about their odds in such a confrontation. So why start a war you had a good chance of losing? To understand this paradox, we need to examine the grand strategy chessboard in 1914, where the Germans and Austrians thought things were heading in the near future, and why this ultimately made them willing to risk a European conflict. Since 1894, Europe had been divided into two competing alliance systems: France and Russia on one side, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on the other. Britain had stayed aloof before tentatively joining the Paris-St. Petersburg bloc in 1904. Theoretically, this formed a rough balance of power on the continent, but for much of the period, the geopolitical realities were very different. The architect of this alliance system had been Otto von Bismarck, who for decades had kept France diplomatically isolated through a complex web of treaties linking Germany with Austria, Russia, and Italy simultaneously. His fall in 1890 and Kaiser Wilhelm II's subsequent decision not to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia had opened the door for the Franco-Russian alliance. This was Germany's first strategic blunder, creating precisely the two-front war scenario Bismarck had worked so hard to avoid. Post-Bismarck German diplomacy lacked the subtlety needed to maintain the European balance. From 1905 onward, the Triple Alliance was on the rise. Russian power had been severely weakened by its defeat at Japan's hands that year and the internal revolutions that followed. The Baltic fleet had been annihilated at Tsushima. The 1905 revolt had shaken the foundations of the Tsarist regime. The Russian army, which had previously seemed an overwhelming threat simply by its size, now revealed deep problems with organization, training, and leadership. This weakness gave the Triple Alliance a window of opportunity they'd exploit for nearly a decade.
France's sudden isolation meant that Britain, fearful of unchecked German power, drew closer to Paris to prop them up in the equation. When Berlin tested the waters in the First Moroccan crisis, London's firm support for France combined with French 75mm guns made them back down from the idea of provoking a war over colonial disputes. Instead, the Triple Alliance used Russian weakness to score diplomatic victories. The most bombastic of these was Austria's annexation of Bosnia in 1908, a province they already occupied but which was claimed by Serbia, a de facto Russian client. Feeling betrayed by what was initially proposed as an exchange for access to the Straits, St. Petersburg protested vigorously, and it took a German threat of war to force their back down. This Russian humiliation wouldn't be forgotten. It created deep resentment in the Tsarist court and strengthened their determination to never again yield to German pressure. The interesting thing is that achievements like this, if we can call it an achievement to change the legal status of an obscure Balkan province at the cost of infuriating Russia and needing to be rescued by Germany again, is that these were diplomatic victories rather than military ones. Despite Russian weakness, Germany in particular hesitated to ever push matters to the point of war. Sure, they threatened Russia in 1909, but despite favorable military circumstances, they remained reluctant to actually force a conflict. In fact, they did more than hesitate. In 1912, while Serbia was expanding in the Balkan Wars, a fearful Austria, watching its influence in the region erode, seriously floated proposals to ally with Bulgaria and crush Belgrade. Though there was still a dovish party in Vienna at that point, led by Franz Ferdinand, the fact that Europe didn't stumble into war in 1912 or 13 was largely because Germany refused to tolerate an Austrian war that might bring in the Russians. They didn't abandon their ally completely, supporting what they considered Austria's just objectives like blocking Serbia from getting a base on the Adriatic. But Germany refused to let Vienna actually start the war it wanted. So what changed? What was about to happen would reveal not one, but two converging strategic crises that would make the 1914 conflict inevitable.
So why did this position change? Why, in 1914, did Germany allow Austria to have its war, knowing there was a serious possibility of Russian intervention? First off, it's crucial to consider Austria's strategic situation. The Habsburgs' problem was that their place in the European system was collapsing at an accelerating and visible rate. The empire was infamously multi-ethnic, with Germans and Magyars ruling over minorities that included Italians, Slavs, and Romanians. Unfortunately for Vienna, these three ethnic groups had national homelands bordering directly against them, creating what Austrian strategists called the problem of irredentist nationalities. This wasn't merely a theoretical problem. It represented a concrete existential threat manifesting in increasingly dangerous ways. Serbian nationalist propaganda circulated freely among South Slavs within the empire. Italian newspapers openly agitated for the annexation of Trieste and Trentino. Romanian intellectuals in Transylvania dreamed of joining Bucharest. Each of these threats, considered individually, was manageable, but the convergence of all of them simultaneously created a perfect storm, threatening to tear the empire apart from within. At the beginning of the century, this didn't seem like a major problem. In 1905, for example, Serbia had been weak and under Austrian influence. King Peter Karađorđević had just ascended the throne after the brutal assassination of King Alexander Obrenović, and Serbia needed Austrian support to stabilize. Italy remained a relatively firm part of the Triple Alliance, bound by treaties promising territorial compensations in case of changes in the Balkans. And Romania's king, Carol I, was personally committed to the Austro-German bloc, having signed a secret treaty with the Central Powers as far back as 1883. The situation seemed manageable, even favorable. By 1914, the situation had changed dramatically and alarmingly. Serbia had doubled its territorial size after the Balkan Wars, annexing Macedonia and parts of Kosovo. This growth wasn't simply geographic, it represented a massive increase in resources, population, and military prestige. The Kingdom of Serbia went from being a small Balkan nation to becoming an emerging regional power with aspirations to lead all South Slavs. The Quartermaster General told the Russians that by 1918 they'd be capable of deploying 500,000 well-trained and equipped troops. This wasn't an empty number. It represented an existential threat to Habsburg influence in the Balkans and a magnetic pull for Slavic populations within the empire. The Serbians didn't hide their ambitions. The organization, Unity or Death, popularly known as the Black Hand, operated openly, promoting Greater Serbia through propaganda and direct action. Italy was still technically part of the Triple Alliance, but the Habsburgs, determined as always to step on every rake possible, had repeatedly snubbed them during the previous decade. The annexation of Bosnia in 1908 had been done without consulting Rome, violating the spirit, if not the letter, of alliance agreements. Worse still, when Italy invaded Libya in 1911, Austria had been notably unsupportive. Relations had cooled considerably. In 1913, Rome had made its position clear by condemning very firmly any potential war against Serbia. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio di San Giuliano privately declared that Italy wouldn't feel obliged to support an Austrian war of aggression. Italy's relations with France weren't exactly spectacular either, but the country was clearly moving toward the Entente camp. Italian nationalists increasingly looked toward the Austrian provinces of Trieste, Istria, and Trentino as irredentist lands that should be liberated from Habsburg rule. Even Romania was now tied to Austria only by the elderly King Carol. Crown Prince Ferdinand was married to Princess Marie of Edinburgh, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and raised in England with strong Anglo-Russian ties. He was much friendlier to the Entente than his uncle. Hungarian attempts to Magyarize their Romanian minority had also deeply alienated public opinion in Bucharest. Budapest's linguistic and educational policies in Transylvania were seen as a national insult by Romanians. When King Carol died, the country would inevitably pivot to the Russian sphere. And Carol wasn't young. He was already 75 in 1914. His death could come at any moment, and with it would come the shift in alliances Austrian strategists so feared. But what was truly terrifying for Vienna wasn't these problems separately. It was what they meant when you looked at them on a map.
It's when you start looking at this emerging catastrophe on a map that you can understand Habsburg pessimism. They came very, very close to losing as it was in 1914 against a Serbia still recovering from the Balkan Wars, with a neutral Italy and Romania, and a Russia that hadn't yet completed the Great Program. The numbers simply didn't favor Austria in any realistic future scenario. Let's examine what Austria would have faced on other fronts beyond the Russian. Serbian expansion meant the Austrians might have actually needed the Potiorek army group that they briefly diverted against them in 1914, but permanently. Serbia was no longer an opponent that could be dispatched with a punitive expedition. It would require serious and sustained military commitment. The possibility of a hostile Romania also served as a double blow, even if they didn't formally join the Entente. Literally just the possibility of them doing so was a devastating shift in military calculations. In 1914, Austria deployed absolutely nothing on the Romanian border and trusted Carol's word. Russia, in contrast, deployed 6 divisions, admittedly pretty weak from what I can find. After Carol's death, this situation would have completely reversed, and the Austrians would have had to produce basically an entirely new army out of nothing, while St. Petersburg could have withdrawn theirs and reinforced other fronts. In 1914, Konrad von Hetzendorf estimated that if the Romanians joined with Serbia, Montenegro, and Russia, the Central Powers would face 128 divisions against their 62. The math was brutal and got worse every year. These weren't paranoid speculations. They were military projections based on observable trends and concrete data about army growth and alliance shifts. Finally, as the Entente grew in strength, there was every likelihood that Italy would hitch itself more firmly to this wagon. The haughtiness of Austria and Germany in their relations with Rome was a particularly strange feature of the pre-war world. Though the Germans despised the Italian army, it was supposed to play a crucial role in the Schlieffen Plan, sending 3 corps to the German left wing and attacking across their own border. In fact, if they'd actually joined in 1914 and pinned down the French Alpine army as expected, the Germans would have won. Instead, because apparently pretending to like the Italians was too much trouble even for the sake of European domination, Rome stayed on the sidelines when war came, and Joffre could move his Alpine divisions to the Marne. This was one of World War I's cruelest ironies. The Triple Alliance lost Italy not through some grand dramatic betrayal, but because they simply hadn't bothered cultivating the relationship when it still mattered. Now, Austria-Hungary absolutely wasn't a lost cause in 1914. Its economy was strong and growing at impressive rates. The industries of Bohemia and Austria proper were globally competitive. The monarchy was very stable despite national tensions. Dynastic loyalty remained powerful, particularly in the Alpine provinces and among conservative classes. The empire had survived existential crises before, from the revolutions of 1848 to the war with Prussia in 1866, and had found ways to reinvent itself. But there simply wasn't any approach the empire could realistically take to counter all these emerging threats simultaneously. The military was always underfunded anyway due to fights between the Austrian and Hungarian governments, and there were no signs this would change soon. The empire's dualism meant every military budget increase required tortuous negotiations between Vienna and Budapest, with the Magyars constantly resisting any spending that didn't directly benefit Hungary. Actually, the only solution was the one Franz Ferdinand seemed to be groping his way toward. Namely, the Habsburgs were going to have to swallow their pride and reach an accommodation with the Russians about the Balkans that would have heavily favored St. Petersburg. This would have meant recognizing a Russian sphere of influence in the Balkans and focusing on internal reforms to strengthen the empire from within. This was, of course, anathema to people like Count Leopold von Berchtold and General Conrad von Hötzendorf, who saw any concession as the beginning of the end. So what I'm hoping to show here is a picture of why Austria felt so desperate in 1914. When someone's backed into a corner, they're very likely to fight. Franz Ferdinand's assassination gave Austria its casus belli and allowed them to get the German approval they always knew they needed for a war to destroy Serbia. The Archduke, ironically, had been the most moderate voice in the Habsburg court. His death removed the main obstacle to Vienna's war hawks. However, this Austrian desperation explains only half the equation. Later, you'll discover why Germany, which had always restrained Austria, finally gave the green light in 1914. Hit that subscribe button if you want to understand how a multi-ethnic empire can strategically collapse without losing a single battle, because what comes next reveals the even graver crisis facing Germany, the most powerful nation in Europe.
Truth be told, there is nothing particularly unique about resorting to military action to subdue a strategic threat. The British had done it against the Boers, the Italians against the Turks, the French to some extent in Morocco, and the Russians had tried it with Japan. The difference with Serbia was, of course, that it would probably trigger the Great European War, and so, despite all their bluster, the Germans always stopped short of agreeing to such a campaign. Why then, having rejected Austrian plans in 1912 and 13, did the Germans approve in 1914? Once again, strategic context can provide tremendous insight. As mentioned earlier, since 1905, interactions between the great powers had revolved around the basic fact of Russian weakness. This doesn't mean the Germans thought Russia was helpless or could be ignored. The sheer size of the Russian army, its immense population, and its vast natural resources always inspired respect, even fear. But what it does mean is that the Triple Alliance had more freedom of action in international affairs. They could take calculated risks, press diplomatic advantages, expand their interests. The balance of power decisively favored Berlin and Vienna. 1911 saw this landscape change dramatically. The major reforms Russia had implemented after the Japanese War, from land tenure and labor rights to railway administration, all began bearing substantial fruit. Stolypian's agrarian reform, though controversial, was creating a class of property-owning peasants who increased productivity. Railway reforms had improved freight transportation efficiency. Military reforms had begun professionalizing the officer corps and modernizing equipment. Combined with additional loans from France arriving at hundreds of millions of francs annually and a period of excellent harvests boosting grain exports, Russia had an extremely healthy trade balance with rapidly growing state revenues. This in turn financed what became known as the Great Program, a major expansion of the army, navy, and railway network that would fundamentally transform the European power balance.
The numbers were impressive and deeply alarming for Berlin. The Russian peacetime army was going to expand from 1.3 million men to 1.71 million by 1917, but the real change was in the strategic infrastructure that would support it. Russia was building strategic railway lines to its western borders at an unprecedented pace. The St. Petersburg-Warsaw line was being doubled. New tracks directly connected mobilization centers with the German border. They were modernizing fortifications in Poland and Galicia. They were creating advanced supply depots that would allow sustained offensive operations. German military observers in Russia sent increasingly alarming reports about the scale of these improvements. The most critical element was mobilization speed. In 1914, the Russians still took 26 days to fully mobilize their armies, compared to 16 for Austria and only 12 for Germany. This 14-day time difference was literally the cornerstone of all German strategy. The Schlieffen Plan absolutely depended on being able to defeat France before Russia could mobilize its massive forces. But from 1917 onward, according to German projections, Russian mobilization times would have been fast enough to allow an invasion of East Prussia and potentially Silesia within the first 2 weeks of war. This completely destroyed the time window in which Germany expected to win in the West. But there was more. The Great Program wasn't just speeding up mobilization, it was also dramatically increasing Russian offensive capacity. The new railways would allow deploying more troops more quickly to the borders. The new supply depots meant these troops could be supplied for sustained offensives. Modern fortifications in Poland would create secure bases from which to launch invasions. Germany faced the prospect of a Russian army that wouldn't just mobilize faster, but would hit harder and penetrate deeper into German territory from the very start of any conflict. What comes next will reveal why the seemingly technical shift in mobilization times completely destroyed German hopes for victory.
This strategic reality completely canceled out the Schlieffen Plan. As everyone knows, the scheme called for Berlin to send 7/8 of its army west, turn the French flank through Belgium, and crush them against the German border within 6 weeks. Quick victory in the west would then allow transferring forces east before Russia could fully mobilize and seriously threaten Germany. The plan depended entirely on exploiting Germany's rapid mobilization and Russia's slow mobilization times. It was a race against the clock where Germany had to win in the west before the Russian steamroller could fully get going in the east. The Great Program therefore completely nullified German strategic assumptions. This really can't be emphasized enough. All of Germany's hopes for survival in a two-front war were basically undone by Russian rearmament. The 14-day mobilization advantage that had been the foundation of the Schlieffen Plan was about to evaporate. You can see how much this worried them with the 1913 Army Bill, which raised their peacetime standing army from 650,000 to 890,000 men. This was a massive and extremely costly increase that required unpopular new taxes. To be clear, Germany was an immensely powerful country with a robust and growing industrial economy. It had Europe's largest steel industry, a highly educated workforce, and world-class infrastructure. It could afford this increase and boost it even further if necessary. But this didn't change the inescapable reality that the fundamental assumptions on which the Schlieffen Plan rested would soon be completely obsolete. More German soldiers wouldn't solve the structural problem of facing a Russia that could mobilize almost as fast as Germany itself. And so, again, you can see how, at least for the militarist faction in Berlin, the walls seem to be closing in around them. Strategic calculations grew darker with each passing month. Every intelligence report on the Great Program's progress made German prospects seem more desperate. But this was only the beginning of the real problem, and just when it seemed things couldn't get worse for Germany, military logic presented an even more terrifying conclusion.
You might think Germany can just stay on the defensive in the west and divert its main armies east. Well, the Germans thought this was such a bad idea they suspended planning on it in 1912. The German General Staff had considered this alternative scenario known as the Eastern Deployment and categorically rejected it. Going east threw away Germany's two best hopes of winning this war, namely its mobilization speed and its tactical superiority against a concentrated Western enemy. If the Germans redirected eastward, the Russians would happily bog them down in the vast expanses of Poland and drag Berlin into the long war of attrition almost nobody on either side of the fence thought Germany could win. The distances in the east were monumental. Supply lines would stretch hundreds of kilometers. The Russians could simply retreat deeper into their territory, extending German lines to the breaking point. Napoleon had learned this lesson the hard way in 1812, and German strategists hadn't forgotten his example. That's even if the Western Front holds in this scenario, something the Germans weren't at all sure about either. Without German forces pushing toward Paris, could the French break through in Alsace-Lorraine? Could Britain land more troops and seize the initiative? Could the Western Allies penetrate German defenses and threaten the industrial heart of the Ruhr? Now, in reality, we know everyone underestimated how effective entrenched defensive firepower would be before World War I. The combination of machine guns, barbed wire, and modern artillery made offensives bloody and costly beyond anything planners foresaw. We also know Germany could sustain operations in a long war better than they themselves thought. The German economy proved extraordinarily resilient under pressure. But what I'm trying to show is that the Germans themselves didn't think this way in 1914. For them, all the structural advantages of a long war were with the Entente. The Entente had greater manpower. France, Russia, and Britain together could mobilize more soldiers than the Central Powers. It had access to world markets through British naval dominance, while Germany faced a potential blockade. It had the potential to expand with new allies like Italy and Romania, while Austria-Hungary watched potential allies turn into enemies. It had time on its side to economically strangle the Central Powers through naval blockade. Every year that passed without war, this imbalance worsened from the German perspective. Every year the Great Program advanced further. Every year the Entente bond strengthened. Every year German options narrowed. What was about to happen in the summer of 1914 would represent the final convergence of all these crises. The most fateful decision of the century was about to be made. Smash that subscribe button if these strategic calculations are revealing a whole new perspective on 1914 for you, because the decision Germany made that summer would change the world forever.
Basically, this is the central thesis then. Germany and Austria saw their strategic position in Europe collapsing and couldn't find any realistic way to mitigate their decline. Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, the German chief of staff and nephew of the famous strategist who'd won the German unification wars, thought 1914 was the last year they could contemplate a war against Russia with any reasonable hope of victory. Every month after that, the odds would tilt more decisively against Germany. That summer seemed to offer the best set of circumstances Germany would have for a while, possibly forever. The widening of the Kiel Canal had just been completed in June, allowing them to use the high seas fleet for operations against Russia in the Baltic if necessary. This wasn't a minor detail. It meant German dreadnoughts could transfer rapidly between the North Sea and Baltic, giving crucial operational flexibility. The 1913 Army Bill had fully come into effect, giving them their maximum peacetime military strength and better equipment. German harvests had been excellent that year, providing abundant food reserves to sustain a prolonged war if necessary. In contrast, Russia still hadn't completed the Great Program. Strategic railways were still under construction, with years of work remaining. New divisions were still in training, not at full operational capacity. Advanced supply depots weren't yet fully stocked. France still hadn't fully extended its conscription from 2 to 3 years, meaning their available forces were smaller than they'd be in 1915 or 16. Germany's window of opportunity was closing rapidly, but it was still slightly ajar in the summer of 1914. It was now or possibly never. To be absolutely clear, this isn't an argument that the war was premeditated in the sense that Germany planned to start it on a specific date no matter what, nor does it mean decision-makers in Berlin thought the July crisis had to inevitably lead to war. There were moments during the crisis where back-down was still possible, where diplomacy could still have worked. What I am arguing, however, is that the strategic situation shows why figures in Germany who'd previously always served as a stabilizing force in the European system, when push came to shove, were suddenly willing to risk a conflict in 1914. The strategic context had changed so dramatically that what once seemed unthinkable now seemed necessary. Franz Ferdinand's assassination didn't cause World War I in any simple sense, but it provided the catalyst at the exact moment when both Germany and Austria-Hungary had internally decided the status quo was unsustainable and strategic trends were moving decisively against them. It was the pretext they needed at the precise moment when they were psychologically prepared to use it. But what was about to unfold in the following weeks would reveal this desperate gamble was exactly that, a game of Russian roulette with the fate of millions.
When Austria sent its ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd, they deliberately designed it to be unacceptable. It contained demands no sovereign state could accept without effectively surrendering. It wasn't a good faith negotiation, it was a carefully crafted pretext for war. And this time, unlike 1912 and 1913, when Germany had reined in Austria, Berlin gave its full, unconditional backing. The famous blank check of July 6th had given Austria the certainty that Berlin wouldn't back down, no matter how far the crisis escalated. Why did Germany abandon its previous policy of containment? Because the strategic calculations had fundamentally changed. Key figures in Berlin, especially Moltke and Chancellor Theobald von Papen-Hollweg, had reached the grim conclusion that war was likely at some point anyway, and that 1914 offered better conditions than 1915 or 1916 or any subsequent year. Waging only meant facing a stronger Russia, a better prepared France, a more cohesive Entente coalition. This wasn't blind bellicosity or irrational militarism. It was deeply rooted strategic pessimism based on concrete military projections and observable trends. It was the logical, though tragically mistaken, conclusion of men who saw power trends moving inexorably against their nations and who sincerely believed that waiting would only worsen their position. They thought they were making the rational choice to fight while they still had some chance, rather than wait until they had none. Of course, there were dissenting voices in Berlin. The Kaiser himself had moments of doubt and panic when he realized Russia might actually intervene militarily. There were discussions among German leaders about whether the Balkans were really worth risking everything. But decision-making structures favored military hawks over diplomatic doves, and once mobilization began, the inexorable logic of train schedules and military plans took over. Mobilization became an almost automatic process that dragged Europe into war. The deepest tragedy is that this strategic logic, while understandable from the German and Austrian perspective, was based on assumptions that would prove fatally flawed. The war didn't last 6 weeks as they expected. The Schlieffen Plan failed spectacularly when the French held at the Marne. Defensive firepower made rapid offensives impossible, creating the trench stalemate nobody had foreseen. And Germany turned out to be capable of fighting a long war much better than its own pessimistic planners had believed possible. The German economy proved more resilient, German society more cohesive, the German army more effective than anyone expected. But in July 1914, nobody knew this, and so the Central Empires made their desperate gamble, sincerely believing it was their last reasonable chance for survival as great powers in the European system.
We can, of course, debate whether the situation really was as dire for Germany and Austria as they believed. Russian historians like Dominic Levin have convincingly argued that Russia's booming economy wouldn't have lasted indefinitely. It emerged from a fairly specific set of favorable circumstances that weren't necessarily sustainable. Their strong trade balance, for example, had begun deteriorating by 1913 and 1914 as grain prices fell. Grain exports faced greater competition from Argentina, the United States, and Canada. Massive French loans might not have continued at the same generous pace if the French economy faced its own challenges. Similarly, there are persuasive arguments that the entire Tsarist government was on politically unstable ground by 1914, evidenced by tragedies like the Lena Goldfields massacre in 1912 and the growing strike movement in industrial cities. Internal social tensions might have significantly weakened Russia's ability to project power externally and sustain a long war. The Tsarist regime might have collapsed from its own contradictions without needing a European war. Russian political and economic history really isn't my main area of focus, so I can't make any fully confident, informed judgment here on these complex questions. Internationally, however, the Anglo-Russian agreement also showed signs of strain, as the two empires repeatedly clashed over the fate of Persia and Central Asia. And certainly some scholars, like Christopher Clark, have suggested the Anglo-Russian Entente wouldn't have been renewed in 1915 due to these persistent tensions. The historical rivalry in Central Asia between the British Empire and Russia had deep roots going back to the 19th century Great Game, and it hadn't simply disappeared because both feared Germany. Personally, though I've made videos sympathizing with this view previously, I've increasingly come to see this as doubtful. In the British Foreign Office, influential people like Arthur Nicholson and Eyre Crowe were still strongly anti-German or pro-Russian, and in St. Petersburg, Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov was genuinely a convinced Anglophile. The Persian question was basically composed of misunderstandings and lack of coordination rather than fundamental conflict of interests, but both powers still saw the strategic need to work together in the region. The common adversary in Germany provided stronger diplomatic glue than many contemporaries recognized or than revisionist historians have suggested.
Whatever the case, with the benefit of historical hindsight, it's possible to argue there were still opportunities for Berlin and Vienna to avoid disaster. Ambitious internal reforms in Austria-Hungary, particularly the federalization Franz Ferdinand apparently contemplated, might have eased some national tensions and stabilized the empire. More skillful and less arrogant German diplomacy might have exploited natural fissures in the Entente between powers with contradictory interests. Time might have revealed fundamental weaknesses in Russian rearmament that weren't apparent in 1914. Strategic patience might have been rewarded. But, of course, what matters for understanding the decisions of 1914 isn't our informed opinion from the 21st century with all the archives open. It's the opinion of the German and Austrian foreign offices in 1914, based on the information available to them then. And their views were exceptionally grim and pessimistic. They saw a future where their power and influence diminished inexorably. They saw enemies growing stronger while they relatively weakened. And they saw 1914 as possibly their last chance to change this seemingly inevitable fate through decisive military force. I'm not claiming this is the complete and definitive solution to the origins of World War I. Far from it. The conflict has many fathers, of course. Serbian arrogance and ultranationalism, clumsy Russian diplomacy during the July crisis, French ambition for revenge for 1870, British naval policy that unnecessarily provoked Germany, the collective failures of diplomacy in July, the individual personalities of leaders and their character flaws, all played crucial roles in producing the disaster. But I do think the international strategic situation can give us profound insight into why those fateful decisions were made precisely in 1914. It helps us understand why men who weren't insane warmongers, who genuinely feared war and understood its potential horrors, ultimately decided to risk everything. It shows us how fear of the future can be more powerful than fear of the present. And it reminds us of the timeless lesson that in international relations, perception of strategic reality can be just as important, sometimes more important, than objective reality itself.
Drop a like and subscribe if this video changed your understanding of how empires make their most fateful decisions, because every week we break down the historical moments that transformed the world and the strategic perspectives contemporaries couldn't see.